What true non-paranormal story gives you chills? Posted one day ago. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Seeing that photo of the guy hiding in the trees, the kid took a selfie on a mountain trail and sent the pic to his family, then went missing. After closer inspection, they noticed there was a guy crouching down hiding in the trees behind where the kid was, on this trail that no one was supposed to be on. A guy was sleeping on top of fridges at a grocery store trying to hide from work. He fell between the wall and one and died there. Nobody knew where he was until his rotting body stunk up the place. When I turned 18, I got my first apartment. I started using the laundry down the street. I noticed the owner would show up within 10 minutes of my arrival. Didn't matter what day or time. Always trying to chat me up, drive me home, etc. Creeper dude. One day, a man I didn't even know was there and yelled at him for staring at my clothing in the dryer while touching his hand to the door. He was staring at my panties. It was so uncomfortable, I began to take my laundry back to my parents. About 10 years later, scrolling Facebook, I see an age progression for a teen girl who disappeared from that laundry a week before I began going there. I never forgot how scary he was and would have remembered any missing child posters or even newspaper articles because I was a daily reader then. Turns out, this fucker is the only suspect. Also, lived across the street from me, so it explains why he always arrived when I showed up. I had to walk past this place with my clothes. She's never been found. The story of the finding of the German tourists in Death Valley. The discoverer was able to provide the meat of the story of their attempts to reach safety whilst also discussing his own issues with the remoteness of the terrain. It's two stories in one, and both are compelling and dangerous. It is both fascinating and scary at moments. There's an older Swedish murder case where a husband murdered his wife by essentially boiling her alive in their sauna. He'd clearly been planning the act for a while and showed little remorse when confronted. It's just an incredibly disturbing case. I heard this story on the Spooked podcast, told by one of the women it happened to. These two women were camping in the southwestern United States and took a hike to a hot spring, and I believe were the only people there. While they were soaking, a man and his dog showed up, and the dog was circling around the women, and even rubbing up against them. The man said some things that made the women weary of him and generally had a bad vibe. As he was walking away, he said something along the lines of, "I'll see you ladies later." They were frightened and upset because it would take a while to hike back to their car at the trailhead. It was getting dark, and they were in a very isolated place. As they were hiking back, they saw a flashlight and heard the dog bark, so they took off in the opposite direction. They ran uphill through scrub brush and trees for a very long time, all the while being pursued by the man and his dog who were barking. They realized that the dog brushing up against them was probably its way of getting their scent. The woman telling the story described how she always thought adrenaline would take over in a situation like that, but she became extremely exhausted and even told her friend to go on without her. Finally, they came across a home and banged on the door. Thankfully, the homeowner was there and let them in right away. They told him to close the blinds and lock the doors. Shortly thereafter, a car came screeching up the road, and from inside they could see its headlights as it circled the area, then seemed to give up. They called the police, of course. I don't remember if there was a solid conclusion like an arrest, but listening to that story was absolutely terrifying, and it stuck with me for years. ETA. Also, I highly recommend Spooked if you're a podcast fan. The first season has a mix of supernatural and stories like the above. Later seasons do lean more heavily on ghosts and things. A few years ago, in Saratoga, New York, there was a guy who would break into people's houses just to watch them sleep. Never took anything, just watched people sleep. They caught him, but it apparently really messed with the minds of the victims. Saratoga Sleeper Creeper. Nice name. When my sister was 9 or 10, she was walking home when she encountered an older teenaged paperboy. She said he knocked her down, threw his bag over her head, and wouldn't let her up. She fought like hell, but felt like she was suffocating. She finally broke away and ran home. WTF. It was so unexpected and bizarre. She never told anybody, and she never saw him again. That was probably back in 1977, and I only learned of it recently. Nothing fancy, but makes you wonder what the fuck was wrong with this kid and what his motive was. I have a personal one that I've been waiting for an Ask Reddit thread where I could tell it. So when my mom was in college, she worked at a local restaurant as a server. She's heading home around midnight one night after her shift, and a bunch of cops are outside of her apartment. Here's the story as it was relayed to her by the cops and her neighbors. Earlier in the night, the neighbors noticed a guy hanging around her door acting sketch. They called the police to report a possible attempted robbery. Police show up, and the guy is nowhere to be found, but upon trying the handle, the door to my mom's apartment is open. Neighbors are adamant they never saw the guy leave the area, so the cops decide to go in and look around the place. While inside, they open her closet door, and the man is standing there completely naked. He is, of course, arrested, and my mom arrived soon after with the police hanging around to let her know what had happened and why they had to go in her house. My mom was so freaked, she drove all the way back to her parents' house that night and took the rest of the semester off. Gives me the heebie-jeebies thinking about what would have happened if her neighbors hadn't have happened to be looking out the window, or if they had decided to mind their own business and not call it in, or if the cops had thrown up their hands when they couldn't immediately find the guy and just left. Very possible I would not be here today. I'd say the story of the guy who died in Nutty Putty Caves. He got stuck upside down in a small crevice and rescuers couldn't free him. He died from cardiac arrest after 27 hours. I'm never going spelunking after reading about it. His body is still there. They couldn't get it out, so they left it and filled the cave with concrete. My aunt told me this story of when she was a teenager. She was driving in her car in a suburban neighborhood, and she saw a young girl walking with an older boy. It stood out to her because the girl was crying. A couple of days later, the girl turned up dead, and the boy was arrested. Apparently, he had raped and killed her. She said it's her biggest regret that she didn't stop and check on the girl. Sylvia Likens, no context. I love true crime, and I've read a lot of fucked up shit, real and or fictional. But man, I never want to read that shit again. It's a goddamn harrowing. The first time I read it, I couldn't get it out of my head for a week or two straight. Every night at 11:35 p.m., I always see the same exact car drive past my house with his headlights turned off, and I get chills. Because I generally leave my window open at night and like to look outside, so I see this ghost car, and it fucking scares me. The Delphi murders. 2 girls killed in broad daylight on a public hiking trail. Perp's body and voice is captured on video by the victim, and no arrests. No tips have led to anything. It's not supposed to be that easy to get away with a double murder. Someone, somewhere, knows this guy. The Hinterkaifeck murders. 6 people were killed on a farmstead in Germany in 1922. The killer lived with the corpses for 3 days. It was never solved. Might have just been a random drifter looking for shelter from the snow. The creepiest part is that their maid had quit 6 months prior, citing strange sounds in the attic as one of the reasons. She thought it was haunted. Then the homeowner found a newspaper in their house that no one had bought, and that no one in the area subscribed to. Finally, days before the murder, he tells a neighbor he saw footprints in the snow leading from the forest to his house, but not going out again. A few years ago, there was news of a college girl who was kidnapped and was later found to be dead. She was raped and shot in the head. Turns out she was taken on my street next to my house at around 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning. She was walking home, and the guy that took her was riding a tricycle or trike. It's a motorcycle with a roofed sidecar in my country. At the time she was taken, I woke up to the loud engine of a motorcycle just being driven away. I stayed in my bed and went back to sleep, not thinking much about it, only concluding it was some drunk. But yeah, it was the sound of a motorcycle driven by a very evil man, taking a girl with him at gunpoint. I know I couldn't have known what was happening at the time, but it made me feel like maybe should have done something, anything. And I know it was just the sound of a vehicle, but I felt like I witnessed something unknowingly bad. And also that incident made me always go home before dark. When I was a kid, we'd go to these beach cabins in Maryland right by the Chesapeake. They were small, rustic ordeals with basic comforts, nothing fancy like TVs or air conditioning, 2 bedrooms and a cot in the kitchen, and my siblings and I rotated on the cot so that no one got too sore from it. A small tradition was that my mom and I would have hot cups of tea before bed in our summer jammies, and just our way of relaxing while everyone else went off to read or listen to music. Well, One night, I was settling onto the cot when she picked up the tea kettle to fill it. Out of the corner of my eye, I see her flinch, then say in a steady voice, "What are you doing there?" My head whipped over to the kitchenette to see her looking out the window. Then she jumped back and started screaming for my father. Somehow, he knew shit was getting real, ran from the back bedroom and barely paused to see my mom point towards the left side of the house. He burst out the door and towards the left of the cabin. I'll be the first to admit, I ran like a motherfucker and baseball slid under my parents' bed because, damn it, I was 10 and that's what kids do when they're terrified. I still remember the smell of the old wood and the feel of my teddy bear shielding me from whatever the hell was happening. I remember seeing my 14-year-old brother, then a medium-ranking karate student, following my dad out the cabin at full speed. The rest of the story is an amalgamation of what I heard and what my family filled in for me. My father, a former Army sergeant and MP with a Bronze Star, managed to tackle the guy that had been peeping into our kitchen window. He put him in an elbow lock face down on the ground, my brother standing sentinel over both of them, while my mom ran to get the cell phone we'd bought just 2 weeks earlier. This was in '95 when those suckers had cords and everything. While my mom called 911, I remember hearing the guy talking. He was saying things like, "The Ouija board fucking told me. I want the devil to suck my fucking brains out. Satan is in cabin 10. I have to get to cabin 10. The devil wants me to kill myself," and so on. We were in cabin 3, over half a mile from where he apparently intended to meet the devil. My dad kept a grip on him for probably a good 15 minutes until the cops showed up. The first thing out of the one's mouth was, "Jamie, when they'd let you out?" He'd been released from jail just 2 weeks earlier for arson. You know where he was standing when my mom was at the sink in the kitchen? Right beside the propane tank. When I was in 3rd or 4th grade, 1960s, I was walking home from school and this old guy in a car pulls past me, throws the door open and yells, "Get in!" My hair stood on end and I took off running and screaming. He chased me down and tried to get me to get into the car. After running up the road, he finally peeled off when I got close to some houses. Had I gotten into that car, I know I would have never been seen again. My mom preached never to go anywhere with a stranger. We lived in a small town. I'm a guy. The story of Daniel LaPlante. There's quite a bit of information, so I'll try to sum up the creepiest bits. Daniel met a girl named Annie and took her on a date or two. They talked for a while, but eventually Annie found him to be a bit creepy and dumped him. He continues to stop by the house uninvited, but quite sneaky about it. He'd tap on the windows and stuff, get Annie and her sisters riled up and scared. They'd try to convince their dad someone was out there, but he was often working and didn't hear or see anything. So, one night, the two sisters went to the basement to do a seance, trying to contact their mom, who had died somewhat recently, I believe. They hear tapping on the walls and run up the stairs. All is well for a while, but the tapping and knocking continues. It comes from all over the house, and they can't figure out why. One night, Dad finally heard the knocking and investigated. He opened a closet door to find Daniel standing there with a knife or machete. That's scary enough, but Daniel was also wearing his late wife's wedding gown. I think makeup too, but not sure. Dad fought him off, and he was finally arrested. If that isn't weird enough, they found out he had been moving around, even spending the night inside the walls of their house. That's how he'd watched them, and it explains the constant knocking from all over. Prior to this incident, he had raped and murdered a pregnant woman and drowned her 2 children. I left out a fair bit of details, and maybe the timeline is off, but I'm telling this from memory. So I don't know if this counts as paranormal or not, but I have to post this somewhere. I live in an apartment in a pretty big city, and last night I was watching one of those creepy encounter Reddit videos. After finishing, I was heading over to my girlfriend's place, thinking to myself about how I've never really had any creepy encounters, and some random existential shit like the different dimensions of reality. I get outside my apartment, and this big homeless dude jumps up from his seat, where he has all his bags, and stands right in front of me. He grabs me by both arms and pulls me into him, telling me how much he loves me. I don't really know what to say, and the guy seems unstable, so I just say that I love him too awkwardly. The man pulls me closer, grabbing me tight with this creepy-ass grin and starts saying, "It's crazy that out of all the dimensions of reality, we're standing in the third, you and me, right here, right now." I'm really freaked out at this point, because what I was just thinking is unfolding right in front of me. I look into this guy's face, and his pupils are gigantic. I can barely see the whites of his eyes, and I notice he's missing a ton of teeth. He keeps holding me, and I keep trying to go, but he won't let go. I eventually pull away from his grip to get away and go grab some food, and when I came back 5 minutes later, he was completely gone, bags and all. I have no words to explain the utter fear and confusion I felt in those moments. My mom once told me that when she was younger, she had a stalker who almost got into her house. It's been years since she told the story, and it's obviously not something she likes to bring up, but she'd often get a feeling of being watched and somehow twigged that she was being stalked. Eventually, she noticed signs of attempted forced entry to her house and called the police. They couldn't find anyone in the house, but as her then boyfriend was away on a work trip, an officer stayed with her that night to keep a lookout. A few days later, she was doing the washing up and sewing, and a man stood in her back garden, looking straight at her. She was naturally terrified and called the police. The way she told the story was full of pity. I believe it even made the local paper, and it transpired that the guy was known for having developmental issues and had a crush on my mom, but still frightening.